Having discussed all the different ways that you think about training, create trainings, and plan for trainings, we now turn to the question of how you actually pull a training off. Now in practice, it involves making phone calls, spending time making notes, putting together your presentation, getting there on time, making sure you get to the right place, standing in front of groups of people, talking, giving out assignments, answering questions, giving good advice, trying not to look like an idiot. Well, this whole series of things that more or less you could imagine. But how to do it right, or how to do it well, that's a question that's worth asking. Now your book goes through and it articulates more or less as a chapter on public speaking. And it tells you all the different things that you should do when performing a training. But I think training is actually a really interesting phenomenon from a communication perspective, because it's not merely public speaking. It is correct to think that, in a way, what a training is a performance, or it's a piece of public rhetoric that's enacted. We speak when we train, so it's not wrong to think about it that way. But there are sort of three levels of communication that we often distinguish from in communication. So the first level is interpersonal communication, right? One-on-one relationships. The second layer is organizational or small group communication, which right, is groups of people and how they interact. And that third or higher layer is the cultural or rhetorical or the public speaking layer. It's the kind of broad mass unidirectional kind of messaging that gets out there. And a lot of times it's not too hard to peg something in one of these three areas. So a fight between you and your roommate very often is an interpersonal conflict. Now it might creep up into organizational if you've got a lot of roommates, but more or less that's an interpersonal thing. Whereas when the president gives a speech, that's rhetorical. That's that higher, that third layer. But a training is, in a way, a mixture of all three of these fields. It's true to think of it as a performance. It is public speaking. It is, you are creating a piece of rhetoric. But it's also correct to think of a training as creating an organizational reality, bringing together a small group and creating a small group of learners. So equivalently, you're not only performing, but you are also enacting, creating, forging an organizational reality. It's also true to think of it from an interpersonal perspective, to say that what a training is to forge a series of interpersonal relationships, teacher-student or trainee, trainer-trainee relationships with a group of people, and that it's really a series of interpersonal relationships. All three of these things are true, and a good trainer is aware that they're operating on three levels. They're messaging, they're creating a community, and they're creating and forging relationships. So when talking about how to train people well, it's important to get that it's going to involve public speaking, organizational, and interpersonal skill sets in order to do it right. So as I said before, your book, it goes into those public speaking things. If I had to boil it down into kind of a single, this is pretty much always a safe bet. When it comes to the speaking component, try to be dynamic. Try to be interesting. Try to put a little bit of energy into it. This is, you usually have time to prepare for trainings. Bring your A game. Be dynamic. Try to be interesting. Come up with stories. Vary your speech pattern. Dynamic. There's plenty of non-dynamic trainers out there, and so that's the first one. So that's that layer. The second layer, the organizational layer that I want to draw your attention to. If you have to be one thing in order to create a learning community, that is facilitative. Now that's a word that we throw around a lot, to facilitate. It means to make easy or to kind of lead by setting things up in the right kind of way so that what needs to happen happens. But it's really actually a very complex idea. When you facilitate, you don't really lead, you create situations, you create an environment that, well, facilitates a certain kind of thing happening. So if you go into a training and you think, well, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say this, and we're going to be done, then you're probably missing that middle layer, which is to try to create a learning community. And let's face it, usually, particularly if you're a visiting trainer, the people that you're teaching are going to have more real and permanent relationships with each other than they're ever going to have with you. And so it's important that while there may be information that you want to dump down on them, right, one-way information transfer, that it's also important to set up a network of information transfer between your trainees. Now, this can be done in a lot of ways. In truth, a lot of activities are about facilitation. Discussions are about facilitation. But when you're thinking about, okay, how do I become an excellent trainer? Okay, be a dynamic presenter, and then after you get that nailed, then start thinking about how can I facilitate organizational learning? How can I get it so that the organization itself learns? And that's trickier, but really ultimately it involves creating opportunities to forge knowledge networks inside the organizations, and this can involve giving them resources to share, inviting them to talk and discuss about the stuff afterwards, giving them assignments or challenges that they work on afterwards that they have to work together on. Things basically to get them to share their knowledge. So you're bringing what you know, but you're also trying to create an environment where everything that they know can kind of slush around and they can learn from each other. So, on the public speaking level, be dynamic. On the organizational level, facilitate. Now, on the interpersonal level, you might think to yourself, am I really creating a series of relationships? And the answer is yes. Now, if you're training, say, 100 people, and you're going to be there for 2 hours, there's no way that you're going to actually have interpersonal relationships with a bunch of people. But you will have interpersonal encounters with key people, and those key people will touch the rest of the 100. And usually you're not training 100 people. Usually you're training, 20 or something like that. And in a few hours, you will have an opportunity to interact with every one of those trainees. So on the interpersonal level, my suggestion to you is be immediate, or have high immediacy. And if you're not familiar with that term, interpersonal immediacy basically means openness, it means receptivity, and the reason it means being present. That's why it's the word immediacy. It means paying attention to what's happening in front of you. So I'm sure you've talked to people that while you're talking to them, it's like they're thinking somewhere else. Or a great example is when someone's texting, you can have a conversation with them, but it's not a real conversation because they're somewhere else. That would be low immediacy. They're distant. Whereas when somebody's paying attention to you, you're having coffee with them, and when you talk, they look you in the eye and they respond to the things that you're saying, and they ask you questions because they want to know what you're thinking. That's immediacy. And that is an important trait in a trainer. And at first you might say, is that my job to have a series of relationships with people? And the answer is actually kind of, yeah, it is. We place high importance on that rhetorical construction, what I say in my training. But a huge part of teaching is role modeling. A huge part of the reason that people take up extra work is because they're inspired, and they tend to be inspired by people that they actually relate to. Consider if somebody walks in and tells you what to do and then walks out not giving a crap who you are. Do you give a crap what they think because they didn't have, take the time to know your name or talk to you? No, we think of distant trainers as arrogant. We think of them as way better than us. And if you get pegged as arrogant or egotistical, you can basically sink your chances of really inspiring or ultimately teaching people, getting them to change their behaviors in a way that makes them perform better inside of an organization. It's not going to happen if they hate you. Whereas if they like you and they want you to like them, then they're more likely to do the things that you ask, right? So that Right, they'll do what you ask of them because they like you, or they liked you, and they would want to make you proud, or they want to prove that they learned something in your training. So interpersonal immediacy is the thing that you're shooting for there at the interpersonal level. So we've got dynamism, be a dynamic speaker. We've got facilitation, facilitate knowledge communities, and we've got immediacy, be interpersonally immediate. Talk to the actual people that you're actually in front of. Now, one of the things that I believe is that as a trainer, one of these things is going to be our strong suit, usually. Oftentimes, our competence lies in, say, one or two of these domains. I definitely really enjoy the construction, the rhetorical construction of training. I like to think about the ideas and figure out ways to order them, and I like to speak and present. And I also consider myself a fair facilitator. But I'll definitely admit that my weakness as a trainer is in an interpersonal perspective. It's not that I'm like an unlikable guy, but a lot of times my brain is elsewhere and I'm not talking to the actual person that I'm standing in front of. And so, I might be thinking about what I'm going to say in my next, training bit. I'm bad with names. And so as a trainer, I know that my area of improvement is definitely at the interpersonal level, crafting those literal relationships, those one-on-one relationships with groups of people. I know other people, though, they're different, right? They're great at the interpersonal stuff. They know people's names. They make great eye contact. They're very engaged. And they're not only listening to the person they're talking to, they're thinking about other people that they've talked to, and then they're networking them and hooking them up, and they kind of like build it up from the top, from the bottom up. And so, they're talking to people and then learning how to network them, and then by the time it comes for them to actually present their ideas, they might not be as strong, but that doesn't mean they're not as good of a trainer because they have a different skill set. So I encourage you to ask real honest questions of yourself. Which of these things do I think comes naturally to me? Where do my strengths lie? Am I a great organizer? Am I a great speaker? Am I great at relationships? And then also identify, of the three of those things, this is the one that I really need to work on. It's not something that you're going to get out of a lot of training textbooks. A lot of times people focus on the rhetorical constructions, the public speaking element of it, but do not ignore that there's an organizational and an interpersonal reality at work, and that's something that you can improve also.